It is almost, it is difficult to make a selection because, as you said, I actually spent 30 years going around the world. And essentially what pushed me to go from one place to another was that there was the opportunity for an interesting experience. So what I would say, though, that possibly the most important thing that happened to me, almost serendipitously, was that when I was at university, I went on a trip to Australia as a young student who wanted to see the world, and I happened to stumble upon the construction of the new Parliament House in Australia, and I thought that would have been an interesting place to work in, particularly for my thesis. And so I went back to Italy, and I ended up returning to Australia a year later, and I spent a whole year working on the construction of Parliament House, which eventually became my graduating thesis at the University of Rome, which eventually led to my applying for a Fulbright fellowship that took me to the United States, where I essentially started to do almost exactly the same thing that I did in Australia a few years earlier. And even to this date, I'm actually working on almost exactly the same things that I tried to tackle as a student 30 years ago, that October of 1987, when I started to work at Parliament House. Well, the reason why I moved to Switzerland from Australia very recently, after 20 years in Australia, was because I was given the opportunity of working within an environment that was very, very different. And the difference in that environment is that it has three different schools together: architecture, civil engineering, and environmental engineering. And it is a place which is very much connected to the region, to the territory around it, as well as the industry. So what I'm doing here in Switzerland with my research laboratory, which is called FAR, which means two things. First of all, that the things that we're working on may be very far, but that's not an excuse good enough not to go there. And the other thing is that it is an acronym. FAR, as an acronym, F-A-R, means for an architecture of reality. And so what we're trying to do is to understand how the future reality can be designed. In order to do that, we are trying to tackle big problem landscapes. So at the moment we're about to start a big research on the impact of environmental comfort design in the history of the watchmaking industry in Switzerland. So how were the hundreds of buildings that were designed and built over the last 150 years in Switzerland responding to criteria of internal comfort, so that people working on very precise micromechanical tasks could actually do that work precisely and eventually lead to Switzerland being the capital of watchmaking that it has been for all that time. So this is one example, and we want to do it in order to see whether those industrial systems that were developed with the help of very smart buildings 100 and 150 years ago are still current, and so could actually be exported in principle, not in reality, to other economic realities in the world that are experiencing the same transition from countryside to city, from rural systems to urban systems. So this is one example. Another example is that we're just about to start on a project which is possibly more ambitious, and there's a challenge, and whether or not we can actually design and build a digital platform for Africa where anyone that is actually building something with international aid could connect to in order to understand whether or not the same experience on that construction site has been already had by anyone else, of the thousands of people, organizations and project teams that have been working on the continent to try and raise it from the conditions in which it is at the moment. So this is the second one, and the third one is we have 7 projects at the moment, but I'm only giving you 3. And so the third one is something that has to do with social structures in building. In the recent past, we've done quite a bit of work on the introduction of digital innovation in the construction industry. But at one point we realized that technology by itself doesn't actually count for much, because those who implement the available technology are those who work with it. And so by looking at analyzing a number of projects done in Australia with digital technologies, we have realized that people are far more important than computers. So we're trying to model what happened on successful stories of technological introduction in Australia and see whether the social structures that we have identified with a, in a sense, with a funding method of identifying play characters in each project can actually be used without the digital technology and only in light of the social power, and see whether the same structures of work can actually be either implemented or facilitated or suggested in parts of the world that may not have the technology but have the people to work together. Well, I mean, this is the $1 million question in a sense. I do suspect that it depends on the language the one uses. Funnily enough, and I think that architectural education, professional education in general, will take divergent paths depending on local cultures and the communication potential of the language that one uses. Because in the English-speaking world, there is no doubt that digital lectures, sort of distant, remote delivery, is actually taking off. Which means that in a very short time, in fact even today, a student of architecture in America could actually take or listen to lectures on their computer, on her computer, in another part of the English world. And that will possibly determine a major selection, not only of universities, but of the people that will be delivering education to hundreds of thousands of potential students around the world. And so at that point, I think the question becomes, what is the role of the university if you actually can gain your theoretical knowledge at least in a distant way. And I think that university will then become much more central players when it comes to the experiments that they make, to the practical training, to opportunities for taking from applying some of the intellectual reflections that one might have been able to produce from watching the computer. And eventually, I think, we may find ourselves moving towards almost an anarchical system where people educate themselves almost autonomously, but it would be the task of the university to make sure that everyone has reached a level of an appropriate level of education. So it's in a sense, I think the universities will become the guardians of appropriate knowledge, rather than necessarily the shepherds of education. My advice for the architecture students would be to understand that the best educational model is Alice in Wonderland. So go out, travel, and understand that one has the luxury. This is the only discipline that has the luxury of being able to experience the results of one work in the world in which you live. So anything would actually contribute to your understanding of architecture, provided that you have the eyes to see it. And it wasn't me that said that, but it was Le Corbusier. But we should live in wonder of what the world around us is like, and also consider that if we pay attention to that, there will be millions of opportunities to make it even better.